It's OPB Politics Now for Friday, September 22nd. There's an unusual recall election underway in Eugene, which pits one of the state's top pro-labor lawmakers against one of the state's largest labor unions. And there's change in the air in Portland. This week, Portland's police chief announced his resignation ahead of a big city government overhaul. We'll talk about what all this means today on the podcast. I'm OPB Portland politics reporter Alex Zielinski.
And I'm OPB state politics reporter Dirk VanderHart.
So Eugene voters may have been surprised to receive a ballot in their mailbox last week. It's focused on a single issue, whether to recall longtime Eugene Representative Paul Holvey. It's a result of a campaign led by one of the state's largest labor unions, United Food and Commercial Workers Local 555. Dirk, we've talked about this Holvey recall in the podcast before, but now the election is here. Remind us who Paul Holvey is.
Sure. Paul Holvey is one of the longest tenured lawmakers currently serving in Oregon. He's a Democrat that's been repping his Eugene district since 2004. And while it's a good bet, he's probably not a household name. In the last 20 years, I think he's gained a lot of influence in the legislature. He is the House Speaker pro tem. He chairs the influential Business and Labor Committee. He's got a role actually on a very powerful budget committee, too. But I think if you ask most people to sum up Holvey's career, they will tell you that he's sort of become the poster child of a labor-friendly Democrat. I mean, people in his own party would probably tell you that admiringly. Maybe some Republicans would say that as a criticism, but that is very much his reputation in Salem, is this guy who is he's a former union carpenter. He's a former union rep himself, and he looks out for the interests of labor and working people. I actually talked to Holvey earlier this week about the recall, and he literally started listing off awards that he's received from labor groups over the years. So he definitely owns this persona.
Yeah, so that makes this even weirder, right? Like, why is a major labor union trying so hard to get Holvey ejected?
That has exactly been the question. When UFCW announced it was going to try to recall Holvey back in May, a lot of people in Salem were surprised. They were scratching their heads because it is pretty clear that there are lawmakers who are far more averse to the union agenda than Paul Holvey. So why him? And, I think the answer is pretty complex. We know that the main reason, sort of the inciting event to this recall, was a bill that UFCW put forward in this year's legislative session. The bill was an attempt to make it easier for cannabis workers to unionize. And really what it said was that if a dispensary owner wanted a license to operate from the state of Oregon, they would have to agree not to stand in the way of attempts to unionize by employees. There were, I think, a lot of nuances, but that was sort of the big thing. UFCW says this is a policy that's been enacted in a couple other states. It was pretty sure Oregon would be next, but then it ran into a problem with Holvey. He believed that the law actually was preempted by federal law. He actually got a couple opinions from legislative attorneys raising that possibility. And he ultimately refused to pass the bill from his committee to the House floor for that reason. He instead sent it to another committee where maybe it could be worked on, maybe it could be amended and fixed. Instead, it died. And that really just made UFCW apoplectic. The union has said he ignored them, ignored their arguments. It's accused him of being in the pocket of the cannabis industry. And shortly after the bill was put on ice, this recall emerged.
Right, but that's just kind of one of several arguments the union's making, right? What do those other ones look like?
Yeah, exactly. There are a lot of claims flying around in this recall. I mean, UFCW has essentially dredged up any disagreement it had with Holvey in the past several years to make this argument that he has drifted away from being the union ally he once was. Just a couple examples. So, and a couple examples that are going to be very familiar with Eugene voters at this point. UFCW blames Holvey for leading on this 2019 bill that trimmed public employee pensions. That was actually a bill that was pushed very heavily by now Governor Tina Kotek. She really was a leader on it, I think. It was voted on by a lot of other Democrats, but UFCW is trying to put it on Holvey. I think we should note that the very unions who represent workers whose pensions were actually impacted by that bill, that the public employees, are backing Holvey in this recall, as is every other large labor group in the state. That is a nuance that UFCW doesn't often mention on that claim. Another one the union raises is this 2021 bill that sent federal stimulus payments to low-wage workers. In an early draft of that bill, it would have targeted those payments directly to frontline workers. workers like the grocery store employees UFCW overwhelmingly represents. So UFCW is saying Holvey was a key catalyst in watering the bill down, snatching money away from its employees. I think that is probably an oversimplification at best, but it is certainly an emotional argument. I think the overall gist of what UFCW is arguing is summed up by the union's longtime president, Dan Clay. Here's what he told me.
What Paul Holvey talks about as values being, that's great. That's something that we agree with. But when you look at what he actually does, his actions don't match what he says he stands for.
That's what Eugene voters are hearing now, what they've been hearing for weeks. And the big question is going to be whether it's an argument that sways people who have reliably reelected Holvey for almost 20 years.
So successful recalls are very uncommon for Oregon lawmakers. It's been more than 3 decades since a representative was successfully recalled, but attempts at recalls aren't that rare, right?
Yeah, right. In the last 4 or 5 years alone, we saw something like 4 recall attempts against Governor Kate Brown, former governor. They went nowhere. Supporters couldn't get enough signatures. We've seen recall attempts against lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. So, for instance, former Democratic State Representative Tiffany Mitchell was targeted by a conservative group in 2019. That went nowhere. Numerous Republican lawmakers were targeted by pro-gun groups when they wouldn't walk away from the Capitol to block a gun bill. Those went nowhere. Oregon isn't like some states that require petitioners to have a valid reason to launch a recall. Here you can do it for really whatever reason you like. But it turns out it is pretty difficult to mount an organized effort to get enough signatures to qualify. As you said, Alex, the last time we saw a state representative successfully recalled was 35 years ago in 1988. And that was a man who pleaded guilty to child sexual abuse. Holvey and his allies say that's the kind of circumstance a recall needs to be reserved for, is appropriate for. They say this is just reckless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Does it feel like this recall has gone further than those other attempts?
Yes, it has, and that's for one reason, and that's UFCW has a lot of money and it's willing to spend it. In order to actually force this recall election on October 3rd, the union had to collect a little less than 5,000 signatures from voters in Holvey's district. It spent around $200,000 to do that, which is a lot of money, obviously, but in the context of getting 5,000 signatures, definitely a lot of money. The union has also been buying ads in the Eugene Register Guard. It's been sending out mailers and flyers. And then earlier this week, we saw a pair of dueling television ads popping up on Eugene TV from each side. Here's a bit of the one that UFCW is running.
He derailed COVID assistance for frontline workers and led the charge to slash benefits for our teachers and firefighters. Those aren't the values we need in Salem. Vote to recall Paul Holvey. We deserve better.
So that ad is highlighting some of the claims I had talked about earlier. Here's a little bit of the Holvey ad.
It's downright reckless.
Ridiculous.
The recall of State Rep Paul Holvey is a reckless effort to overturn a fair election.
More of that argument that this is just not an appropriate effort. This is something that just doesn't happen for Eugene legislative races. Eugene's obviously a liberal city. Holvey's a Democrat. He hasn't had a competitive race in a very long time. And he says he's never actually had a TV ad in the district targeting him. So this is new. He also told me that he's spending more on this race than he's spent on any other race to run for the legislature. Here's a bit of that.
A lot, like 20 times more than I've ever spent probably on any individual campaign.
That's just, one more thing that is out of the ordinary here in this kind of head-turning race.
Yeah, so let's say this recall succeeds. What would that mean for the state legislature and, next year's short session?
I don't know what impact it has immediately for the short session. What I can say is that the lawmakers I've talked to about this see this campaign as a pretty explicit threat. They see this as UFCW saying essentially, if you don't listen to us, if you don't toe the line on our bills, we are going to come after you with everything we've got. And the fact that they're trying to take out Paul Holvey, this guy who's sort of seen as a uber labor Democrat, maybe drives home that point further. I talked to Senator Floyd Przansky. He is a Eugene Democrat. He's one of Holvey's closest allies in the legislature, and that's how he sees it as well.
I believe that is one of the reasons why they chose to take on Paul. He's top dog in labor. I have to assume, and Dirk, this is just an assumption, that they feel that they can take him out, they can put a chilling effect across the legislature.
Now, that is, of course, if this recall succeeds, which is very much not certain. I think the other interesting question about this is what signal union leaders like Dan Clay get from their tens of thousands of members if this thing goes down in flames on October 3rd. Remember, this is an effort that has involved more than $200,000. That's money that comes from union members. It's also one UFCW pretty open antagonism from the Democrats that are in power in the state, meaning they're less likely to be friendly to the union's proposals going forward. So, if this fails, those members might question whether all of this was worthwhile or actually maybe counterproductive.
Mm-hmm. So there's somehow another bonkers element to all of this, but more news involving UFCW Local 555 that you reported on this week. It involves so-called black ops. What can you tell me about that?
Yes. So in a very strange turn of events, the person who ran signature gathering for this Oregon UFCW recall campaign, this guy named Joe Emmons, was actually sued last year for defamation by a union in Washington. And not just any union in Washington, but a UFCW chapter, actually the largest UFCW chapter in the country. So this dates back to 2021 when the UFCW locals in Seattle and Spokane were considering a merger. Apparently, Emmons traveled up to Spokane during that time. He visited grocery stores in the city where UFCW members worked, and he sort of planted flyers around the stores urging workers not to approve this merger, making all sorts of insinuations about union leadership and inappropriate payouts and covering up for sexual harassment. And we know that Emmons did this because he was, one, caught on tape doing it, and two, he admits it in court. Exactly why Emmons went to mess with Washington UFCW is unclear. Exactly why then the Oregon UFCW hired him to run its signature gathering campaign is unclear. Court documents don't say who paid for this Black Ops assignment. I did ask Oregon UFCW's officials if they had anything to do with this, since they've had a fairly long relationship with Emmons and they declined to comment. What we do know is Emmons is being represented by some very high-priced attorneys as he defends himself from this lawsuit. So, yeah, it is just another strange angle to all of this.
Yeah, well, let's head north to Portland, where Police Chief Chuck Lovell announced he'll be leaving his post this week. Lovell has served as chief for about 3 years during a particularly rocky period of time in Portland, and his departure may mark the beginning of kind of a new chapter of city leadership in Portland.
Yeah, and you were on the front lines covering this week, Alex. My question was, did you see this coming? Did it feel like a surprise that Lovell was stepping down?
I think the timing of this week was a little bit of a surprise, but it was pretty clear that Lovell didn't love the position. He was essentially thrust into this role overnight in June 2020, and just weeks after the city erupted in racial justice protests. And the past 3 years have been really hard. City saw record homicides, traffic fatalities, drug overdoses, and the police bureau has been struggling to retain officers and lost a lot of community trust during the protests. Lovell acknowledged that during a press conference where he announced his resignation this week.
I remember in 2020 when the former chief, Jamie Resch, announced she felt she had to step down, essentially take a demotion from chief because we were in this racial justice moment and she didn't feel like she should be the person piloting the police bureau through it. And all of a sudden, people got introduced to Chuck Lovell, and he seemed just as caught off guard as we all were. Like he hadn't really been lobbying for this.
And if I remember, I think he was appointed to like a higher promotion just like days before he got this chief promotion. So he was just kind of like reveling in one new kind of rung up the ladder, and then suddenly was like, and now you're chief. Which is
at maybe one of the hardest moments to be chief in our city's history. So have fun, Chief Lovell. Who is going to be replacing Lovell at the police bureau?
So that job is going to a former police bureau leader named Bob Day. He has been around for quite a while. He worked for the police bureau for nearly 30 years, where he led the training division, and he worked as a deputy chief under former police chief Danielle Outlaw. He's pretty well respected by rank and file officers and the public, and has a soft spot for community policing, kind of like Lovell did. He retired in 2019, but he said he took the opportunity to come back to lead the Bureau because he's deeply passionate about Portland and public safety. He's pretty hopeful about the future of Portland, which is a little unusual to hear from leaders right now. He waxed poetic during a press conference this week about the task. Here he is quoting civil rights leader James Baldwin.
He said, "Not everything we face can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." My commitment to you is a willingness to face the things that need to be changed.
He also said he's not naive about the city's challenges, but feels like he has the experience needed to steer the Bureau during a rough patch.
You know, Lovell announced this resignation at a notable time. I mean, it's a week after Mayor Wheeler announced he's not running for a third term. Are these things related? Do we know?
Yeah, Lovell said that Wheeler's announcement last week informed his decision in a way. He said it would be kind of a good opportunity for a clean leadership transition before the coming city government overhaul in 2025. And it will allow the new mayor and city council to appoint new police leadership as part of their first term. I should mention Bob Day has been appointed as in an interim position to be chief. And he's been very clear that he has no interest in becoming a permanent chief. He thinks he'll just stay around until the new mayor replaces him in 2025. So let's leave the conversation there for the day. Dirk, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Alex.
This week's episode was produced by Andrew Thien, and our audio engineer is Nalene Silva. Our music comes from Audio Network. We'll be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org.